Hi, everybody, and welcome to my weekly cult situation report. I am Daniela, scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership, and author of a book called Uncultured. It's about growing up in the Children of God religious cult before going into the cult of the U.S. Army. And I wrote it the last time a cult leader was running America. We'll talk a bit about that and him calling himself a king as well. And another historical king, King Henry VIII. Anyway, every Friday I do a weekly roll up situation report of all of the things going on in the world of cults and in my world of cults. So, welcome. Please subscribe if you're new. Um, okay, so we had a very interesting discussion on cults and the culting of America this week that was published on our podcast, Cults and the Culting of America, with someone who was in an online cult, a therapist actually, who was in an online cult, right? Nobody is too smart to be conned. Um, and in fact, it was funny because when she was describing, how she got pulled in and how much they loved her and then put her out front, and I was like, oh yeah, you're the recruiter girl. You're the girl that's like so smart and so on it and so good at convincing herself that this thing is awesome that she's great at convincing other people. Sarah Edmondson of Nexium is like that. We love her podcast, A Little Bit Culty. Um, and I'm that girl too, so cults recruit, people often think cults are recruiting non-intelligent people, and that was what scholars used to think a long time ago. It's called deprivation theory. Lack of intelligence or lack of money is what is bringing people into cults, but we now know that that's definitely not true. Cults want the top 1% of people just like everyone does, because those people are hard workers and smart and going to push themselves. I think this is why kids from high control religion do so good in the military, because we've been doing that our whole lives. Like, it's not hard for us. Um, so we had a discussion about online cults versus real cults. Real cults. I mean, like your more traditional, what I sometimes call commune cults, like the one I grew up in, right? And a lot has changed with the internet. I think even in our larger world, this is true, right? And I sort of make this argument in Culting of America that, we had gotten away at the end of the 20th century from charismatic leadership, right? That's what we learned from World War II. And we had walked away from it. We'd built bureaucracies, right? And cared more about reasoning and logic and government functioning than these big charismatic leaders. So what happened? And I think what happened was an apocalypse. The industrial age running smack into the information age and leaving nothing untouched. Right? So this is starting in the 80s and 90s. By the time I'm studying intelligence in Fort Huachuca in 2010, right, the internet coming down is the largest disaster, like precipitates the largest disaster in the world in front of nuclear war, right? That's how big of an apocalypse we have had and how important the internet and the information age has become. And out of this, who arises, right? The charismatic leader, tech bro, right? Steve Jobs being one of the many, right? But these new people that are going to guide us through the apocalypse. And when the world is confusing and scary, that's what people are looking for. And that is what we are seeing going on right now, just at full speed in our country. I think we all get it. Okay. Um, so, but what's interesting is that like cults rely on isolation, right? And constant contact with you. And so it used to be if you wanted to isolate an American, you kind of had to take them off to your compound in Texas or Brazil, right? Back in 1972 when my grandfather joined the Children of God, that's what it was like. But these days, right, AI does a lot of our isolating for us. So we're already in these silos. President Obama spent some of his last time in his last speech in office talking about the silos that we have found ourselves in because of the information era, and how dangerous it is and how it's led to everything that we are seeing right now in our country. um, but just because it's an online cult doesn't mean it's not a real cult that has real impacts on people's lives, right? And the more and more we live our lives online, the more and more impactful these kinds of cults can be, right? So go check out our episode if you're watching this on YouTube or Patreon. It's here. It's just go to the podcast list and you can see the episode with Taylor Marie about online cults. Really good discussion about that. You know, QAnon obviously is one of the most famous kind of online cults, super conspiracies. No one's really sure what to call it. Um, but people genuinely grieve the loss of their loved ones into the Q rabbit holes, right? And there's a whole QAnon casualties subreddit, and you can like see the very real prices that people have paid. Um, and speaking of QAnon, one of the things I spent time talking about this week, because I'm reading a book called Conspirituality for Culting of America that I'm writing, and so I read a part about satanic ritual abuse and how like that wasn't real. That was the witch hunts born again as the Satanic Panic, right? And there's a reason we call it Satanic Panic, not, oh, these people were abused by X satanic cult, right? So, really, what happens is in the 80s and 90s, again, with the information age, right? People are starting to find out in mass just how common the abuse of children is, and often by people very close to those children, like their parents or family members or their churches, right? And so it's easier to believe that there's a satanic ring trafficking children and drinking their blood and carving pentagrams into them and breaking their bones and all of these things than it is that your uncle or your brother is abusing your children, right? And so this whole thing went on in the 80s and 90s. It had a lot of very real victims, the people who were accused, right? A lot of people had their lives ruined. Some people are still in jail, apparently, because of Satanic Panic BS. And in over 1,200 investigations by police, and where police and therapists were doing very, very, very questionable or just outright discredited, horrifying like methods of interviewing children with very leading questions to get the answers they wanted, not one single piece of evidence was produced that this is going on, right? But still, people were coming at me for saying this and just being like, oh wow, like wow, okay. You know, like no, the Satanists didn't just have the best, most secretest cult ever that just never produced any evidence or artifacts, right? Like that's not what happened. Um some children were definitely abused. And Teal Swan is one of these examples, right? So Teal Swan is supposedly says she's a survivor of satanic ritual abuse and all this stuff. She's not. She was Mormon. She's a survivor of that. She was probably sexually abused. We know that purity culture and pedophilia culture are two sides of the same coin, right? And then she was definitely abused by a psychologist called Barbara Snow, who did this to many children, implanted memories, convinced them that they were victims of this stuff. And again, the kind of stuff that would leave a lot of scars, right? That would have some obvious effects that would be able to be verified. And even when it's just testimony, even when it's not physical scars of abuse, like you get a bunch of children of God survivors together, and the stories of the abuse is very consistent with like what we went through and how it tied into the doctrine and how it was justified and all of this stuff. So like, you know, this was the again, the witch hunts born again, which is coming again with QAnon, right? And this is one of the comparisons, and they were saying, oh well, there are real survivors, and I'm like, because sometimes people, like individual children, might have been abused by individual adults doing Satanist things or telling them that or doing this. But it's like, no, that's like saying that Pizzagate was real because this child was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein. Like, no, Pizzagate still was not real. But again, like it's harder to convince people that they have been conned than it is to con people, which I believe is some sort of Mark Twain quote. Um, anyways, fascinating. There's a Peacemakers cult in Costa Mesa, California. So the Peacemakers was a store in Costa Mesa, California that sold quilts and offered crafting lessons. Michelle McKinney won a court case against them that basically said they exploited her labor while she was suffering from mental illness exacerbated by a brain tumor. It's so interesting because brain tumors can come from being under a lot of craziness. McKinney experienced so much of what cult members experienced. She was separated from her child, isolated, and controlled. Separating family members is a big tactic of cults. I talk about this in two places in Culting of America. One is when they're trying to break you down and get you to self sacrifice away your own individual identity. Separating you from your family members is a very important piece of that. And then it's also used within cults to humble you, to break you, to control you. In the Children of God, for example, after convincing people to have many, many, many children together, then the leaders started just like splitting up families and shuffling around parents. I was always very scared growing up that I was just going to be like separated from my mom. Um, Anyways, also an effective way to control people when you have their children. And this is why cults ultimately usually request the sacrifice of the children, of your care of the children or your interference in with the children. And this is because we know, again, that most cults rely on exploitation of labor. All cults, in fact, are about labor. And often it's especially the labor of children. And that is one of the chapters I've been editing this week in Culting of America, talking about exploitation of labor. All right, so, and by the way, as we see here in this example, like this is how you go after cults. If you have, right, the resources and the privilege and the ability to do so, go after them for labor trafficking you. That's how you get them. Much easier to prove than some of the other kinds of abuse, and people are more willing, I think, in many cases to believe it. Okay, so she won a lawsuit in 2022. This is a quote from the LA Times. Although members of Peacemakers last week declined to be interviewed by the Daily Pilot, Orange County attorney Tim Donahue, who represented the group in the original lawsuit, explained his view of the case Friday. Maintaining his former clients offered McKinney refuge when she had no other options. Donahue said those in leadership positions at Peacemakers, including founding member Marie Kolansky, who died in 2012, and named partners Doug Follett and Brenda Stanfield, did not consider McKinney an employee of Peacemakers. She was taken in as a family member on spiritual principles, on biblical principles. She had nowhere else to go and no one to help her, the attorney said. They paid for all her living expenses, took her off the street, and gave her a home, a bed, food, and resources. But in a verdict issued in August 2022, a jury found otherwise. It determined McKinney was owed $596,983 for economic loss and awarded another $1.7 million for past and future pain and suffering. Because there's trauma with having your labor exploited and trafficked as well, right? And being controlled by a cult. For outrageous conduct and infliction of emotional distress. Peacemakers was ordered to pay $1.29 million, while Follett and Stanfield were ordered to pay $516,320,000 and $36,880, respectively. McKinney was also granted attorney's fees. Couple of important things here. When you're living somewhere for free, it's very easy to have your labor exploited, especially children who don't know better, right? Which is what happened to me growing up. I didn't even understand my childhood until I was like 32 years old and I heard Dr. Yanya Lalich say cults are always about labor. And I was like, oh, we were being labor trafficked. Our product, the Children of God, was entertainment. That was what we produced in person and in video and recorded form. And we were trafficked around the world for that purpose. Like, that's what it was. And this means that cults are organized crime. And again, this is how you go after them. Something else, again, that came up this week was another cult expert sort of suggesting, again, that maybe I'm wrong about the military being a cult because the military pays benefits. And I find it fascinating that nobody's definition of cult includes doesn't pay benefits. And like, this sounds like a cult, as many human trafficking rings do, right? They're relying on emotional manipulation and coercion, right? I believe that when we use the word cult, we are trying to say that an individual has come under coercive control, as clearly Michelle has, right? But like, they're paying benefits now, right? Many cults have been sued and have had to pay people, like in this case. We also thought it was funny that it was a crochet cult, a peacemakers quilting, but, threads, knitting. Haha. Anything can be a cult. Okay. Don't go join a knitting cult, okay? So anyway, I go back to the army, right? Like that's what benefits, like the disability benefits that Mr. Knitting Cult Lady and I get. That's just a pre-done lawsuit against the government for breaking us. Okay. All right. So, but going back to when you're living somewhere for free, right? It's very easy for people to convince you, like, we're giving you free housing, blah, blah, blah. We took you off the street, blah, blah, blah. We're training, whatever. And then next thing you know, you're just giving them so much labor. And someone explained it really good in my comments. They were like, if like for regular people with regular paying jobs, right? You're told to budget 20 max 25% of your income for housing. This is obviously why housing inflation is partially very problematic, right? But like, so if you're living somewhere for free, but then they should be taking 20% of a 40-hour work week, right? You should be helping with dinner sometimes and laundry sometimes, and not 40 hours a week of labor all going to free housing. That's not equal. That's exploitation. Okay, so I think that's like a really convenient numerical way to think about it. And I always say this, as soon as we know that cults are all about labor, we can look at every organization and group that we are a part of and ask ourselves, like, how much of my labor am I giving to them? Right. And I honestly think one of the best ways to protect yourself against a cult is like you're never giving 100% of yourself to one organization. So we can be very careful with that. That's also why just sort of the exploitation of labor running rampant in capitalism right now, where like nobody who's on salary works only 40 hours a week. And nobody who's working an hourly wage is only working 40 hours a week because they can't afford to. And so everyone's actually working 60 to 100 hours a week, and we were supposed to be all working 40-hour weeks, and like now we're wondering why America is so stressed and bonkers. Like everyone in a cult is exhausted all the time, and you're walking around like kind of semi zombies, just disassociated, so you can just keep going and going and working, and that's how they want you. And also when people say I'm a content making machine, I'm like, yeah, I'm like a little cult baby. I am so disciplined. 7:30 every morning, I'm sitting there making my videos. You know. Um, so again, like McKinney experienced so much of what many cult members experience, right? She was separated from her child, she was isolated, she was controlled, and she was exploited. And some cults like this one operate very much in plain sight, right? Cults, again, it's about the exploitation of labor. And so there's some product that is produced, and often that product is a commercialized thing. And this is all what I'm writing about this week, editing about in Culting of America. So this goes nicely together, the exploitation of labor chapter. This is kind of the whole, this was one of the fastest chapters I wrote because I'm like, this is kind of the whole book. This is the why. This is why they do it every time, right? It doesn't matter what the ideology is. That's just a vessel to get you committed. They get you to self-sacrifice. They get you isolated. They use language in this way. Family language. What did they say here? We took her in as a family member. Be careful. Anything that calls itself your family wants to overwork you, underpay you, and expect you to put up with more BS than you would otherwise. And yes, I'm going to put that in the musical. Set it to a sick beat so that everybody like remembers it. But why are they doing that? Using us versus them into all of that. It's to exploit your labor. And this is why I always think the step 4 self-sacrifice of members on my 10-part deal is like always tied into 8 exploitation of labor. So check your labor. When you're trying to go after churches, go after their money. And when you're trying to go after their money, go after exploitation of labor. Oh, and hey, my Mormon sibs from another crib, holding your passports when you're on a mission trip, that's in the international definition of trafficking. And yes, I'm going to have the guy in the door knockers cult say that in the musical also. I'm here to help. I'm here to help. So yeah, we have a lot of these kind of corporate cults, or not corporate cults, but like yeah, like cults with like a business front, right? Operating in plain sight. The Yellow Deli is the front of 12 Tribes, which is a cult that is horribly abusive and exploitative, especially of children. The Children of God, where I grew up, we were singing and dancing on the streets in plain sight all over the world. Very few people asking like, why are these children doing this, and are they okay? And we were not. Um, you know, uh, so and it's like some cults are secretive and completely secluded and removed, like the FLDS, the Mormon polygamous offshoots that pretty much just live on their own and want to have their own separate community. But a lot of them are much more integrated into the world than you would think, while still also maintaining sort of like perfect isolation for members. And this is always something to look at is isolation, right? Cults rely on isolation in some way. Going back up to our topic of online cults, right? They're still isolating you ideologically in order to control you. That isolation is very important. And isolation, whether we plan it or not, always increases extremism, which is part of what we saw during the pandemic, and I think is a big reason why QAnon got so big. That isolation. And so people ask me right now, that everything's so polarized and we spend a lot of time talking about cult of MAGA. And people will say, well, so how do we know like we're not the ones in a cult? And so my advice is, think of your favorite MAGA person. And like if you were in their power for like 2 weeks, right? You're a child or you had a broken leg and you just like had to do what they say. How many perspectives, different viewpoints of life, different people who live in different ways could they expose you to? And then flip that around. And how many could you expose them to? Right? And like, maybe you both need to work on your isolation. But like, for me, one side clearly stands out when I do this. I also think I do finally have the answer to people when we talk about politics saying like both sides. Um, from selling out my book now for almost over a month. I'm so sorry if you're still waiting on a book. I promise we're trying to get them to you. But yes, having a two-party system by nature is culty. It is black and white. You are defining yourself as against the other, right? Us versus them mentality. It makes it super easy to use this apocalyptic, oh, it's the end of the world, right? Every election, one side is telling us that if the other side wins, it's going to be the end of America. Um, and more and more and more does that rhetoric abound these days. And we have a bunch of extremists together in the White House right now. So it really is getting bonkers, right? The amount of like Pete Hogsbreath in Doug Wilson's cult, deep in the ILBP world, the same church that Tia Leving survived of a well trained wife. Yeah, deep in extremism himself, right? Amy Comey Barrett, Prince of People of Praise cult, right? Tulsi Gabbard, born and raised in a cult commune, Identity of Science Foundation, I think it's called, something like Science of Identity Foundation. Cult baby, like me, born and raised, just never left. Only ran for president because Sir Cult Leader Chris Butler told her to do so. Actively in a cult. RFK, Scientology connections, AA cult, just like everybody around him is an extremist. And obviously, Elon is just embracing his inner Nazi these days. So, yikes. I did upset people on threads today or yesterday because I put on there, I was like, I grew up in Brazil where like we lived in a city in Belo Horizonte where there were two soccer teams. One was black and white and one was blue and white. And on the days they played each other, we had this blue and white motorhome that had been donated to the cult, and we would have to go put it in a garage because it would get vandalized if we didn't by the fans of the other team. And I was like, I can't wait for that to happen to Teslas. And it was pointed out that that's a little mean towards Tesla owners, and that's true. I wasn't thinking of the individuals. I was just thinking of the cult leader and how like once his stock is tanked, like they're gonna drop him. It's gonna be impressive to see the speed with which they do that, I believe. But also, and so I reworded it, right? I was like, I predict this is going to happen with Teslas. I won't be gleeful about it. I don't need to be hateful, but like, this is how societies control what we will accept as far as luxury goods go, right? Like, it's not really different than pouring paint on a fur coat. And, like, this is why Michael Kors doesn't have a bunch of shops in Brazil, you know? Like, people soon are just not going to accept the ownership of Teslas around them. And I'm sorry for the people that own them, but it's as a sociologist, I'm watching with interest how some of this is going to go. Um, all right, so some updates on my project. I was demonetized on TikTok, which, since it's happened before, we were waiting for this time. So last time I got my account up to 100K and then I was demonetized, and it took me like 90 days to build the account back up. This time I was ready. I already had a monetized backup account, and I think we're already up to like 40K in 72 hours or something, or 48 hours. So we're doing good. We're doing good. We're just like transitioning to a new account in the background. So if you follow me on TikTok and you're watching this, if you follow me at Knitting Cult Lady, come find me at Knitting Cult Captain, because we are transitioning them. So I'm going to be rebuilding that. And so that gives me a little bit of a dip in book sales, although we are back in stock now. Well, at least we're waiting on the book to get here. But there you can buy either signed or unsigned books on my new account. But yeah, it's going to be a little bump. And we're using Sales of Uncultured right now to fund the work on Culting of America. So if you would like to participate, we do have a GoFundMe, and the link will be in the description. That would be lovely. We would appreciate it so much. Working hard to get Culting of America out as fast as we can. It was kind of touch and go if I was going to meet my deadline. And then my lovely spouse, Mr. Knitting Cult Lady, hit some black ice on his electric scooter on his way to college and broke his arm. And then, y'all, this bro gets up, goes to class, takes a quiz. The professor knows he's had a crash, may have a broken arm. He's bleeding from the face, and this professor still lets him take a quiz. I don't know what's up with people these days. Anyway, then he calls me and asks me to pick him up so he can drive himself to the hospital. Y'all, I don't argue with pilots anymore. I just let them do their thing. Anyway, he broke a bone in his wrist, which has to heal super specifically, otherwise he could lose his use of his thumb, and broke a bone in his arm, and he's in a cast. And all this to say, I have now become two people's chauffeurs. And it's, anyway, we're not going to hit our first deadline with Culting of America, but we are still working on it as fast as we can and keeping up with all of the many projects. Lizzie, who's my talent manager, made me this little graphic of all of the Knitting Cult Lady brand projects right now. And it's a lot of things. And oh, hey, there's a musical. And we met someone who might be interested in being a partner, like as an investment partner in the musical. Just got to write the script. And I got to have time to write the script. So I have to finish writing Culting of America first. And I'm hoping by the summer, while the book's in production, I can get to the script. Oh, hey, I never finished that thing that I was saying, where I was saying that I have the answer, though, to people saying that both sides are equally as culty, because, as I hoped that was my 500 books getting here, but it wasn't. I wasn't selling 50 to 200 books a day, cult books a day, when the Democrats were in office. So I at least know that one side, I think, is significantly more culty. We had Cult Theory Book Club this week, where we discussed part 2 of Janja Lalich's book, Take Back Your Life. I love Dr. Janja Lalich as a scholar. We've done Margaret Singer's Cults in Our Midst. And Margaret Singer is like the godmotheress of cult studies, and she's very academic for the knowledge itself, which is very, very valuable. And Janja Lalich's book is, Take Back Your Life. Here, you, the cult survivor, like, here are all the things you need to know just to sort of understand what happened to you. So we have two different book clubs. They're both run through the Patreon, which links will be in the description if you are interested in joining us. We do cult memoirs. So last week we had our discussion about Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died, which we are finally forgiving for coming out 2 weeks before Uncultured and taking all the sales. And usually ends up being like a really good discussion about that story. And, it's useful for people to read other people's cult memoirs, both to see that the stories are not unique, be able to recognize these patterns and everything, and also just to get the language and context to describe our own experiences. Many of you keep asking me to do writing classes, and I do want to do something once I can get the writing of Culting of America off my plate. I think it's going to be like a 3-hour seminar that meets once a month, and we'll do figuring out the writing for 90 minutes and then doing crafts and art and brainstorming how we're going to sell the writing and develop the products and the stuff. I like to sell. I'm good at it, and I like to help people think of things and do entrepreneurial type things and ideas. And, you can make up your job if you're good enough. Anyway, so I think I'm coming to the end of that. I might have been in the middle. I'm sure I was in the middle of saying something when I had to pause for the doorbell, but I was going off the cuff. So we are still mostly on track for Culting of America, though. So I'm, finishing up chapter 7 and chapter 8 this week. Might bleed over a little bit into next week because this has been a crazy week. But then we've got 9 and 10. So even I'm starting to feel like I'm getting close to the end. And while, like, they're in many ways less heavy research chapters because it's like, well, this is what it's all about. So stay tuned for that, as I am right now just working to get through the first round of edits on chapters so I can get them to my editors so that everyone who's working on the book has like read a full draft of the concept. White Woman Whisperer is working on her chapter for community versus groups, which is kind of a little bit of an answer that we're going to offer at the end of the Mostly Diagnosing the Problem book. It's not just diagnosing the problem. It's a book for individuals, and it's intended to help you understand groups that have hurt you in the past, groups that are hurting you now, and groups that might try to hurt you in the future. But we're going to then pass the torch to Rebecca, White Woman Whisperer, who's doing like a really good chapter, and I got to see like a super in-depth outline and stuff she's worked on, and it like literally gives me chills. It's so good. So very excited about that. I'm definitely hoping like the text needs to be wrapped up by spring, for us to try to get it out to you. So working hard on that. If you are interested in donating to the process, again, we'll have that link to that GoFundMe. Using a lot of that right now to just pay like the research assistant and the editor to help me get this out faster because good help costs good money. And we are trying to make a very, very good book. We talked about last thing to talk about is the Hey White Women podcast. So this week's episode was titled You Don't Have to Get Kendrick Lamar. And I started off just talking about how I was learning about the Drake and Kendrick rap battle, and it was so interesting. Even themes of cultural appropriation, which is fascinating because Drake is a half black, half white mother, which is a significant thing, and Jewish. And so is White Woman Whisperer, all those things, though she's American and Drake is Canadian. But, she does not culturally appropriate. And, as we know, we love White Woman Whisperer. She's very, very thoughtful about everything and very good with words. So we just had a good discussion about that and some of the stuff I've talked about on here last week, how I see Drake as kind of this classic cult baby who grew up in the Hollywood cult of fame. Yeah, one more thing about that, right? Cults can be led by an idea or a person. not just a person. And so a lot of people have kind of come at me with this. Well, you said that the army was a cult, and now you're saying that like Trump's not gonna be able to control it that easily. And I'm like, okay, yeah, the military is a cult. Yeah, the bro-splainy voice. I know, because I literally wrote a book about this. The military is a cult, but it is a cult that is led by the idea of the American Constitution. And I think we sort of know this in our culture, right? As soon as anyone defines cults, people go, what about the military? And then every cult scholar has to either go, yes, it's a cult, but here's why we need it, or no, it's not a cult, and here's why. I think I'm the first one to come along and just be like, yeah, it's a cult, and like maybe it doesn't have to be this culty, but we sort of have decided that 1% of our population just needs to be in a cult in order to, do the things they need to do to protect the rest of us and our freedoms. So that's, but that doesn't mean the military is just grabbable by another cult leader and able to drive it. And sometimes I don't think people don't realize that either, that the cult leader is not just interchangeable necessarily. And a lot of times trying to do that is what ultimately fractures your cult and breaks it open. I think, for example, if Felon 47 just like kicked it, I don't think JD Vance would be able to lead, sorry, Shady Vance would be able to lead the MAGA call. I think you start to see a lot of interesting splintering and other things happening because he's just not, he's weird. He's not charismatic even a little bit. I don't think he could do it. And so this you see in a lot of cults, right? It's not usually the cult leader running the cult, right? Like the cult leader would not be the chief operations officer of the cult, right? Like he or she is the inspiration in a lot of ways, the charisma, the queen, right? Like the prime minister is here actually running the country, right? She's the cult leader. Um, oh, and legitimately, I believe the British royal family is absolutely a cult. I've written a lot about that actually. Oh, it's so heartbreaking because with my TikTok kicking me off, I lose my whole cache of videos of things that I've made, like reading out my essay about what veterans Prince Harry and cult babies have in common. And now I'll have to build up a whole new cache of stuff, and then who knows when they'll kick me off again. But here we go. We're playing the game. Yeah, so check out all our stuff. Come check us out on Patreon if this is not where you're watching that video. You can subscribe for free. It's just where you can keep a hold of me as all this stuff changes and flexes, and who knows where we end up. On the Patreon, you can subscribe for free. A bunch of different videos are posted on there. But it's kind of just a hub of everything, right? You get the weekly cult situation report, you get the videos of the 2 podcasts, you also get the shorter content. And Un-American is available there, my second memoir that is instead of looking at group behavior, it's looking at power and privilege and whiteness and otherness and what it means to be an American. And it's not a published book yet, but I did make a video book of me reading the manuscript aloud. You can get access to that as a subscriber at the lowest level. Then we have our 2 book clubs where, as I was talking about, we do cult memoir book club, and then we do cult theory book club where we're really like learning what the groups are about and understanding like what was done to us and how to talk about it. You can come join us for that. Tomorrow is the monthly Stitch and Bitch with Knitting Cult Lady Saturday call, which is also through the Patreon. That is our highest level. We love all of you. Ooh, we added a cool new thing for Patreon members. Now we're doing an AMA so they can ask me questions, and then at the end of the Cults and the Culting of America podcast, we're going to like read out the question and have a little, Scott and I, who are the hosts, will have a little discussion about it. And we usually have a cool guest on, so, they can say things too. So we did our first one last week's recording, so it'll be in next week's episode. And that is most of it for me. I actually, unfortunately, don't have too much with nitpicking this week because I have been working on some bigger projects like this coat that I am making for someone in my community. But I did make a ton of these earrings. I believe I have over 100 And I'm excited because I also onboarded a virtual assistant this week. So I'm getting some help with things. And one of the things she's going to help me do is build Knitting Cult Ladies Closet where people can just buy the things that they like. Because I like that better than doing commission projects. Because I think I have that thing where my brain, it's called pathological demand avoidance. And a lot of neurodivergent people, it's like as soon as someone commissions something from me, I can't make myself get excited about making it, which is hard because I love to make things. So I, of course, have my traditional, at this point, circular logic earrings that I made where I take bangles and I wrap them in yarn. These are super fun. I got little disco ball beads. Um, these ones, the bangles were so beautiful, so I didn't even wrap them in yarn. And on my new order, I got a bunch of matching bangles that are really pretty, so I might do some more like this. I think they're really cool, especially because, like, with my collars, sometimes the earring can be a bit much. But look how fun. Look how fun that is. So my whole idea is I'll have Knitting Cult Ladies Closet, and you'll be able to go into the shop and just buy things, and I'll fix them up and clean them and ship them out. This one I did two different kinds of fuzzy red yarn on the earrings, so like in theory you could have either one forward. I also did. I wore live with my super scrap yarn, and I wore two different earrings, and wow, did that piss off the bros, which is always great because comments, help you go viral more. These pink ones are super fun. I did some. So you're gonna match this, so I'll probably give them to her. Oh, and these velvety ones are super cool. They give fuzzy handcuffs even more than the other ones, so it's nice vibe, I think. Um, and that's what I've been working on. And that's me, folks. Thanks for hanging out. Catch you next week. Check out all my culty stuff and come follow me on Knitting Cult Captain on TikTok. Bye, friends. Oh, and I can't remember if I mentioned it, but on Spotify, Uncultured Audio is there now. So if you are a Spotify subscriber, you can just listen to it for free and I still get paid. Amazing. It was once the editor of Arts and Culture's favorite things of 2023. The audio specifically, which I believe is like a 4.9 rating. I'm pretty proud of it. Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about old Felon 47 calling himself a king. So little PS here, like the good parallel to King Henry VIII, of course. I think he is. I think King Henry VIII is just like such a perfect parallel for every cult leader, which is why I compare the cult leader in my book to him. Um, but like so, Elon Musk was on the cover of Time magazine sitting at the Resolute desk, basically suggesting that he's the president of America. And so Trump is going to respond back with, well, fine, I'm the king. And like, yes, we shouldn't be here with like the president being someone who's this ridiculous person, but we are. But also, then again, the freak out kind of entails and spins up, and people keep going, but he called himself a king. I just realized I didn't have my microphone centered, so we probably caught none of that, and I should start again. I said that I forgot that I didn't talk about Felon 47 calling himself a king. And while, like, of course that's concerning, right? So, like, it all comes because Elon is on the cover of Time magazine, sitting at the Resolute desk, obviously implying that he's the president of America. And so Trump's going to respond with, well, I'm the king. And, like, while it's ridiculous that we are at this point in our nation that this person is the president, like here we are. But also then like the freak out and the spin up, right? People being like, but he called himself a king. And like, okay, then it's good that that's not how it works in America. Like you don't, you can call yourself a king. That doesn't mean you're a king. So okay. Um, I do also did talk a bit about this week how I think it's significant though that one of the things that Elon did was he, posted some classified stuff on an unclassified website, which in theory is a big no-no, but the president is the classification authority. So as long as the president is okay with it, it's not going to be an issue. But as soon as he wants him gone, he can just be off with his Guantanamo. Um, so I think that is the kind of thing that's significant to cult leaders. And this was one of the things that I was getting to when I was saying that like the cult leader isn't necessarily replaceable. I think that if people in the cult of MAGA had to choose between Elon and Trump, they would choose Trump, right? So like he also has the one thing that Elon cannot have. Elon cannot be president. He was not born an American citizen. So he needs Trump as much, if not more, than Trump needs him. Even though he has money and power and stuff, right? So I think there's definitely like a marriage of Satan going on here, but like these never last. These never last. Um, Mr. Knitting Cult Lady, and I have donated quite a bit of money and on his side time to supporting an organization called Vote Vets right now. And part of that is because they are part of groups that are suing Elon Musk for his illegal access to our information. And of course, trying to preemptively fire some warning shots at them for coming, to not come after veterans and veterans benefits, which they have promised to do, which we will be very much affected by. But also, maybe that's the thing that gets us marching. Who knows? We are conveniently located near DC, so if we need to lead a veteran march, we could probably do that. All right, folks, want to get that little part about the king stuff in. Somebody mentioned in one of my comments that they try to not react to any news stories for like 3 days and then see how it matters because so much of the strategy right now is panic and confusion. And I kind of like that. And I realized I kind of do that anyways because when stuff comes out late on a Friday when I'm done working and I don't feel like talking about it till Monday, I don't. And then it either still matters or it doesn't. So maybe there's a little bit of a good rule we can all have with ourselves. It's like, I live near DC and he's definitely wreaking a lot of havoc in the federal government. And there's a lot of things, it's going to have a lot of consequences, but also daily life in America hasn't changed very much. The fabric of our country still matters, right? The members of the military still matter. I made a video where I made a mistake talking about the Tennessee National Guard putting down their shields because I thought that was recent, but in fact, that's from 2020. However, all the people getting mad at me about that seem to be the same people still bringing up, well, Kent State, they turned their weapons, yeah, in the 70s in this one incident. And it is highly talked about in the military and trained so that we won't do that. But what we do have in our recent history is proof of the Tennessee National Guard, deep in Trump country, right? Putting down their shields during Black Lives Matter and siding with the people. So we do have proof that the military will side with the people, and we don't have proof that they will turn on them. And I remind you, as I seem to need to do, soldiers and service members aren't just walking around armed all the time in America. In fact, it's quite difficult to get weapons and ammunition at the same time, even for training purposes. And it's made so. And people seem to underestimate the amount of women, 20%, that are in the military, and black people and minorities, and understand that, like, you cannot run modern day military operations with just one political side of the military. I also like to remind people that it is not the military's job to take over, and a military junta is very unpleasant to experience. I haven't even experienced, just seen and grown up in some countries in the aftermath. Um, but the military's biggest power is to do nothing. Is to do nothing, is to say no. I continue to use this example of like when I was a 25-year-old captain in charge of intelligence for a battalion of combat helicopters. If you had told me to help you gather information against Canada, I would just been like, no, no, and I'm not going to let you into your secret vault either. And then they would have to drag me away to go put me in lockup to then find somebody else. And oh, by the way, I was one of the senior intelligence officers in that brigade because the brigade intelligence officer was new and they would lose a lot of potential doing that. And you only get through a few levels before you just don't have anyone you can put in that position anymore. And I also have that to say about all the fear about, oh, Hegseth's going to fire these generals. And then like, well, and replace them with whom? With whom? You can be relatively incompetent, but you still have to kind of know how to drive the military machine. And military senior officers are quite professional. Someone says, "Oh, so it looks like we're just gonna have to rely on the professionalism of the officer corps." Like, ma'am, you do that every day of your life without understanding it. Like, if you are alive in America, you are relying on the professionalism of the military officer corps in some way or another. So, yes, it just might become more obvious to you. But again, I remind y'all, like, the reason I'm here calmly giving assessments is because we're not there yet. We need to assess where we actually are. Also, I've survived growing up in a hard labor camp. I'd be much better at it at the age of 39 and the amount of manipulating that I could do. I'm only 37. See, I think it would even take time before we get there. Um, just remember, humans survive most things, and we survive better by pulling together. Oh, and I forgot the last thing that is also very significant to talk about is that Pete Hogsbreath went to Stuttgart, Germany, and went on a base there, Secretary of Defense, right? And he was booed by military families.